In this video series, we're going to demonstrate step by step all of the techniques needed to build a half pipe. Now, the half pipe that we're going to be building in this video is actually part of a printed plans and DVD kit, but this video is the full video that you would get if you purchased the product. So the half pipe that you see is what we'll be building. It's a 4-foot mini half pipe. It's 8 feet wide, 27 feet long, and 4 feet high. Now there are plans to modify the ramp, but in this video we're just going to build the ramp as seen here. One of the features of this ramp is that it is portable. If you build it according to the plans, it will fold up into an 8 by 8 by 4 foot cube. And that's great for storing in the winter or just whenever you want to put it anywhere. A materials list of everything you'll need to buy to build the ramp is available on our website at easyhalfpipe.com, and then click on the downloads link. You'll see it right there. Once you have your materials, tools, and an area to build, you're ready to start the transitions.
Before you start construction, be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety instructions that come with your power tools. First, read and follow the directions in the ground preparation section of your plans. Once you have done that, you can begin your transitions. 2 transitions are cut from one sheet of plywood, and it should look like this. Scribe a 20-inch line on a sheet of 1/2-inch plywood using a 2x4 as a guide. On this line, measure 16 inches from the edge of the plywood and place a mark there. Next, measure 6 feet up from the line and mark the axis point with a spike or screwdriver, if you're doing this on soil. Tie one end of a string to a spike and the other end of the string to a pencil or marker. The pencil should touch the 20-inch baseline when pulled tight. Scribe the transition line by holding the pencil vertical and the string tight. This is one of the most important steps of building your ramp. Be sure that the curve you draw is smooth. Scribe another line in the opposite corner from the first, just as you did in step 1. With the plywood raised from the ground, cut out the transition. Be careful not to cut over the curved line. Flip the newly cut transition over diagonally and trace the curved line using the first transition as a template. Cut out the second transition and discard the surfboard section. On the second sheet of 1/2-inch plywood, cut out 2 more transitions using the first transition as a guide. Using the first transition ensures a more accurate duplication. Line up the 4 transitions and drive in 3 screws to hold them together. Along the transition edge, mark the positions of the 2x4s. Be sure each transition is marked. Remove the screws and lay the transitions on the ground in 2 groups and 8 feet apart from each other. Have an assistant hold up the unattached end until screws can support it. Attach the studs to the transition using 3-inch screws, 2 screws at each end of the stud. You start the flat bottom with 2 studs placed at the bottom of the transitions, parallel to the transition studs. Then lay 3 studs between them, 1 at the center and the other 2 at the ends. Then 4 more studs are evenly placed. You will not secure them at this point, but it will give you an idea for the layout. Cut these 7 studs to 7 feet 7 1/2 inches. The goal is to allow 3/4 inch overlap of the plywood on each end of the flat bottom once the two end studs are added. Group the two end studs together and transfer marks where the 7 studs will be attached. From the center, scribe a mark, and at 16 and 32 inches in each direction. Now group the 7 studs together, making sure that they are all aligned at the end. Measure and mark where the support studs will go. Each support stud needs to be staggered to allow for screws later. There will be 3 support studs per section. Attach the end studs to the 7 cut studs using 2 3-inch screws per end. It is extremely important that the joint studs are flush on top. Otherwise, the plywood and masonite will be uneven. Now we will add the cross support studs. Measure and cut each cross stud individually and evenly place 3 studs per section. Secure them with 3-inch screws at each end. Slide the transitions into the flat bottom frame. Using a C-clamp will help eliminate gaps between the studs while you screw them together. And again, be sure that the studs are flush on the top. Attach the transitions to the flat bottom using 12 3-inch screws, 1 screw per section. Finally, secure the plywood transitions to the flat bottom frame with 3 2.5-inch screws. Align a sheet of 1/4-inch plywood on the center edge of the middle flat bottom stud. It should also overlap the center of the bottom transition studs. To make it easy when driving screws, mark the plywood at each stud and snap a chalk line from end to end along the 7 studs. Attach a 1-inch screw to the corner end and drive screws every 10 inches along each edge. Then drive additional screws into the support studs every 10 inches. It is not necessary to drive screws into the short cross support studs. Attach the second sheet of plywood in the same manner as the first. Dry place a sheet of plywood at 90 degrees to the transition. If your measurements were correct, the top edge of the plywood should line up with the center of a transition stud. If not, it's not a problem. You have 2 options. 1. Simply correct it by adding a stud at the required location. Or 2. Remove the stud and reposition it so that the plywood overlaps it halfway. You'll also notice that the plywood overhangs each end of the transition about 1.25 inches. This is okay. You don't need to cut it off. 1/4-inch plywood is fairly easy to bend along the transition as long as you are bending it along its 4-foot side and not the 8-foot side. But if for some reason you are having trouble bending it, boil a pot of water and pour it on the plywood. Let it soak for about 20 minutes. It will be more flexible this way. Mark and snap more chalk lines along the transition plywood from end to end, just like you did on the flat bottom. Secure the transition plywood to the frame using 1-inch screws every 10 inches or so. Dry place another sheet of plywood to the upper portion of the transition. Again, mark the center of the studs at each end of the plywood and 1 more at the top of the highest transition stud, where the coping will be located. You will cut off the plywood past this stud. Remove the plywood and snap a chalk line between the 2 top marks. Then cut along the line. Attach the top sheet of plywood to the transition in the same manner as the previous one. Repeat these steps for both transitions. Sweep the ramp before installing masonite. This removes any loose screws or dirt. Attach the flat bottom masonite to the plywood by marking it and snapping chalk lines, in the same manner as you attach the plywood to the frame. Because masonite is very dense, you will not be able to countersink the screw heads as you did in the soft plywood. You will need to use a large drill bit or a tool specifically designed to sink screw heads. The screw heads must be flush with the masonite. It may be tedious, but it will save you a lot of scars. Add screws every 10 inches or so. The pieces of masonite that attach to the transitions do not attach at a 90-degree angle. They attach in the same position as the flat bottom. Dry place each sheet and mark the location of the studs as well as the top edge of the plywood, where you will snap a chalk line and cut off the excess. Then screw into place as before. Cut out the corners of the transition with the jigsaw. Dry place the coping in the socket. Notice how much it overlaps the transition. If it appears to stick out too far or not far enough for your taste, reposition the top deck stud either backward or forward. This will force the coping to move backward or forward as it rests in the socket. With the coping in the socket, line it flush with the end of the masonite. Mark the coping at the other end of the masonite and cut it to length. The length should be 8 feet. Place the coping in the socket. Use a 1/4 inch drill bit to make 5 evenly spaced pilot holes. Attach the coping to the bottom stud using 3-inch screws. Make the head of the screw flush with the exterior of the coping. With the help of an assistant, place a sheet of plywood on the deck flush with the coping. Underneath, mark the corners where the transition plywood meets the top deck stud. Flip the plywood over and place it on the ground. Measure the distance from the 4-foot edge to the scribed line, and with that same measurement, make another mark at the back edge of the plywood. Join the two marks. Measure the distance of the line that you just made and deduct a 1/2 inch. With that measurement, cut a 2x4 stud that length and do the same thing for the other corner marking, following steps 2 and 3. Then attach both studs to the top side of the deck plywood using 1-inch screws. Stand it up, I gotta grab onto the board. No, rip out. Line it up with the markings. The stud should be on the inside of the line and flush with the back edge of the plywood. Measure the inside space between the two attached 2x4s. Cut 2 studs that length. Attach 1 stud to the ends of the first 2 with 2 3-inch screws at each end. and attach it to the plywood using 1-inch screws. Attach the second stud in the same manner, but with a 30-inch gap between the two. Measure and cut 3 support studs and dry place them. You will secure them later. Measure the height of the transition and cut 3 deck legs that length. This measurement is approximately 44¼ inches. Using a right angle, attach the 3 deck legs with 3 3-inch screws per leg. The center leg is attached midway between the two. Now secure the 3 support beams with 2 3-inch screws per end. Space them evenly. The center support beam will be off-center because of the center deck leg. Transfer the positions of the deck legs to a full-length stud by laying it on top of the stud that secures the legs. Also mark and cut off the excess. Measuring 12 inches from the end of the legs and using your markings as a guide, attach the stud to each leg with 3-inch screws. The cross supports are measured by placing a stud on the underside of the deck plywood on the far side of the long support stud. Angle it down to meet the corner leg. It should be touching the long support stud, the deck plywood, and the corner leg. Mark a line where the cross beam overlaps the leg. Use a right angle to be sure the leg is at 90 degrees to the deck while you draw the line and also when you attach it. Secure the cross support stud with 1 3-inch screw to the deck leg and 3 3-inch screws on the other end. Follow these same steps for the other cross support studs. Flip the entire deck over and slip it into position between the 2 transitions. Attach the deck plywood to the top deck support stud using several 1-inch screws, about every 10 inches or so. To attach the transition plywood to the deck, drive 3 1.5-inch screws into the deck support beam on each side. And that's it. Congratulations, and we hope this video's been a great help to you. Have fun skating!
We hope these videos are helpful. For the whole kit, including the step-by-step DVD, step-by-step manual, materials list, and poster-sized blueprints including ramp mods like a 6-foot with vert, spines, and more, go to easyhalfpipe.com.